The neighborhood was the kind of place that looked flawless in photographs. Wide streets curved gently between rows of near-identical homes, each painted in muted, approved tones that blended into a quiet, controlled aesthetic. Lawns were cut with precision, hedges shaped with intention, and even the spacing of decorative elements felt calculated rather than natural. From the outside, it felt like stability.
Look at this paragraph right
but
here.
Stability,
It says
in
we have 30
environments like
days.
this, often
30
comes
days
with a
until
cost
what?
that isn't
I don't
immediately
understand this
visible.
language.
When the narrator moved into the neighborhood, he believed he had found a place where life could finally slow down. After years of unpredictability, he wanted structure. A clean environment. A sense of order that didn't need constant attention. His property stood slightly different from the rest. Not in a way that violated any rules, but in a way that suggested individuality. The yard was a little more open. The house had subtle design choices that didn't fully conform to the uniform pattern of the neighborhood. At first, that difference felt like a quiet strength. The homeowners association was introduced early, but only in formal terms. Documents were provided. Rules were explained. Everything seemed straightforward, almost reassuring. The idea of shared standards sounded reasonable. It implied fairness. For the first few weeks, everything remained calm. No issues. No notices. No interruptions. The narrator settled into a routine, adjusting gradually to his new environment. Then came the first sign that something wasn't as simple as it seemed. It started with a small observation. A woman standing across the street, watching the property for slightly longer than normal. Not in an obvious way, but in a way that lingered just enough to feel intentional. She appeared again the next day. And the day after that. At first, it felt like coincidence. Neighbors observe each other. It happens in every community. But there was something about her attention that felt different. Focused. Measured. Soon after, the first notice arrived. It wasn't aggressive. It wasn't even urgent. It simply pointed out a minor detail regarding the alignment of a decorative element in the yard. A suggestion framed as a requirement. The tone was polite, but firm enough to carry expectation. The narrator adjusted it without hesitation. He assumed it was part of the process. A small correction. Nothing more. But the next notice came faster than expected. This time, it referenced something else entirely. Another small detail. Another adjustment. Again, not unreasonable on its own. But the timing began to feel deliberate. Days turned into weeks, and the pattern continued. Every time he made an improvement, another issue surfaced. Every time he aligned with one requirement, a new one appeared. None of them were major violations. But together, they created a sense of continuous correction. The house no longer felt like a place of personal control. It felt like a space being shaped by someone else's expectations. The woman he had noticed earlier began to appear more frequently during these moments. Sometimes across the street. Sometimes walking past slowly. Sometimes observing from a distance that felt calculated rather than casual. Her presence became tied to the timing of notices. It didn't take long for the narrator to understand her role within the HOA structure. She wasn't just a resident. She was influence. The kind that didn't need to be announced. Her behavior wasn't openly confrontational. She didn't argue or raise her voice. Instead, she operated through observation and reporting. Through small actions that triggered larger consequences. And those consequences always seemed to point in one direction. Toward his property. The realization didn't come all at once. It built slowly, through repetition. Through pattern. Through the growing awareness that enforcement wasn't evenly distributed. Other homes had visible inconsistencies. Small imperfections. Minor deviations from the rules. But they remained untouched. No notices. No corrections. No pressure. Only his property existed under constant review. At first, he questioned himself. Maybe he was missing something. Maybe his standards were slightly off. Maybe he misunderstood certain guidelines. But the more he adjusted, the more the pattern revealed itself. This wasn't about correction. It was about control. The emotional shift that followed was subtle but significant. The house that once felt like a personal space began to feel monitored. Every decision carried weight. Every change felt like it would be evaluated before it could even settle into place. He started double-checking everything. Not because he wanted perfection, but because he anticipated reaction. Even small actions began to feel strategic. At the same time, the HOA structure itself remained formally neutral. Notices were issued through official channels. Language remained procedural. Everything appeared legitimate on paper. That was what made it effective. The system didn't need to appear unfair. It only needed to apply pressure consistently enough to shape behavior. And the woman at the center of it all understood that perfectly. Her influence wasn't loud. It was precise. She didn't need to confront him directly. The system did that for her. The narrator began to notice something else as well. Neighbors avoided engagement when the topic came close to HOA matters. Conversations shifted quickly. Eye contact broke sooner than expected. There was an unspoken understanding in the neighborhood, one that discouraged involvement. People weren't unaware. They were careful. That caution created isolation. And isolation made the pressure feel more personal than it actually was. But the narrator was not someone who reacted impulsively. He didn't escalate. He didn't confront. Instead, he began to observe. Quietly. He started keeping track of notices. Dates. Details. Changes he made. The time between corrections and new violations. At first, it was simple documentation. Then it became something more structured. A pattern was forming. And once patterns begin to appear, they rarely disappear. They expand. They reveal. They connect. By the end of this phase, one thing had become clear. This was no longer about living in a structured neighborhood. It was about living inside a system where one person believed she had authority beyond the rules. And she was testing just how far that authority could go. But what she didn't realize yet was that observation works both ways. The pattern that had begun to emerge in small, almost dismissible fragments started to take on a more defined shape as time passed. What initially felt like a series of unrelated corrections gradually revealed itself as something more structured, something that extended beyond the surface level of routine HOA enforcement. The narrator's daily life began to shift in response to this growing awareness. His interactions with his own property became less about personal choice and more about anticipating scrutiny. Simple tasks, adjusting landscaping, repositioning outdoor fixtures, maintaining small details, were no longer neutral actions. Each one carried the quiet question of how it might be interpreted. This constant anticipation created a subtle but persistent strain. At the same time, the broader structure of the HOA began to reveal itself through closer observation. On paper, the system appeared balanced. There were committees, scheduled meetings, documented rules, and a framework that suggested collective decision-making. Everything pointed toward fairness. But lived experience told a different story. The narrator began reviewing publicly available HOA records, initially out of curiosity but soon out of necessity. Meeting summaries, financial reports, enforcement logs, documents that most residents ignored, became essential sources of insight. He wasn't looking for conflict. He was looking for consistency. What he found instead was variation. Decisions that should have followed a clear pattern often showed subtle differences. Enforcement timing did not align evenly across properties. Some homes were reviewed repeatedly, while others remained largely untouched despite visible inconsistencies. Financial allocations for community improvements appeared in records but were not always reflected in physical results. Individually, these details could be dismissed as administrative oversight. Collectively, they suggested something deeper. The HOA was not functioning as a uniformly applied system. It was operating through layers of influence that were not fully documented. The woman at the center of his experience began to fit into this structure more clearly. Her role, while not formally dominant in title, carried weight in outcome. Her presence at inspections, her involvement in discussions, and the timing of enforcement actions all pointed toward a level of influence that extended beyond ordinary participation. She was not the system itself. But she knew how to use it. This realization introduced a new level of complexity. The narrator was no longer dealing with rules alone. He was dealing with interpretation, specifically, interpretation shaped by someone who treated the boundaries of authority as flexible. At the same time, the emotional landscape of the neighborhood continued to reinforce the system's stability. Residents maintained distance from HOA-related topics. Even those who had experienced similar issues spoke cautiously, if at all. There was no open resistance, no collective questioning. Silence, in this context, became part of the structure. The narrator began to understand that the HOA did not rely on force to maintain control. It relied on predictability combined with uncertainty. Predictability in the sense that rules existed and were enforced. Uncertainty in how and when those rules would be applied. That uncertainty shaped behavior more effectively than strict enforcement ever could. People adjusted not because they were constantly punished, but because they wanted to avoid becoming the focus of attention. This dynamic explained much of what he had been experiencing. His property had become a focal point, not necessarily because it violated rules more than others, but because it had been selected as a consistent subject of enforcement. Once selected, the system continued to reinforce that focus. The narrator's internal response to this realization was not immediate action. Instead, it was a shift in perspective. He began to see his situation not as a personal conflict, but as an example of how the system operated under certain conditions. This shift allowed him to detach emotionally, at least partially, from the pressure. Instead of reacting to each notice as an isolated issue, he began placing them within a larger context. Patterns became more important than individual incidents. He started mapping timelines more precisely. When notices arrived, what changes had been made beforehand? How quickly responses followed? He compared these timelines with visible conditions in neighboring properties, noting differences in enforcement frequency. The more data he gathered, the clearer the structure became. There were cycles of attention. Periods where enforcement intensified, followed by periods of relative quiet. These cycles did not appear random. They often aligned with internal HOA activities, meetings, reviews, or changes in reporting patterns. This suggested that enforcement was not only influenced by observation, but also by internal administrative rhythm. The narrator also noticed that his compliance behavior influenced the pattern, but not in the way one might expect. Correcting an issue did not reduce attention. In many cases, it seemed to trigger new observations, as if the act of compliance itself kept his property within the system's focus. This reinforced a key understanding. The system was not designed to resolve issues quickly. It was designed to maintain oversight. And oversight required continuity. Meanwhile, the figure of influence continued her routine. She remained present, consistent, and observant. Her actions were never overtly excessive, but always aligned with moments of enforcement. She did not need to assert authority openly. The system carried her intent forward. The narrator began to consider the implications of this dynamic. If enforcement could be influenced without direct authority, then accountability within the system might also be affected. Decisions that appeared procedural could, in reality, be shaped by informal input that was not fully recorded. This raised questions about transparency. Not in a dramatic or confrontational sense, but in a structural one. How decisions were made. How priorities were set. How certain properties became focal points while others remained peripheral. These questions did not yet have clear answers. But they created direction. The narrator's approach evolved from observation into investigation, not in an aggressive way, but in a methodical one. He began organizing his documentation more clearly, grouping notices by type, aligning them with timelines, comparing them with visible conditions elsewhere. The process was slow, but deliberate. At the same time, the emotional impact of living under constant scrutiny remained present. Even with increased understanding, the experience of being continuously evaluated did not disappear. It affected daily routines, influenced decisions, and created an underlying tension that was difficult to fully ignore. But now, that tension was accompanied by clarity. He was no longer uncertain about what was happening. He was beginning to understand how it was happening. And that understanding marked the transition from passive experience to active awareness. By the end of this chapter, the situation had not escalated outwardly. There were no confrontations, no public challenges, no dramatic shifts in behavior. But internally, everything had changed. The narrator was no longer just a resident responding to HOA notices. He had become an observer of the system itself. And systems, once observed closely enough, begin to reveal patterns that cannot remain hidden indefinitely. As understanding deepened, the narrator's experience shifted from confusion into something more layered, an awareness not only of how the system operated, but of how it affected people on a human level. What had once felt like a personal inconvenience now revealed itself as a shared emotional environment, quietly shaping the behavior of everyone within it. The neighborhood still looked the same. Lawns remained trimmed. Houses remained aligned in neat visual harmony. From the outside, nothing suggested tension. But beneath that surface, a different reality existed, one built not on open conflict, but on quiet adaptation. The narrator began to notice the emotional patterns embedded in everyday routines. Neighbors who once lingered outside now returned indoors more quickly. Casual interactions were shorter, more guarded. Even the simple act of maintaining a yard seemed to carry an invisible layer of caution. It was not fear in an obvious sense. It was something subtler, anticipation shaped by experience. Over time, he realized that his own behavior had changed in similar ways. Without consciously deciding to do so, he had begun adjusting how he moved through his own space. He checked details more often than necessary. He paused before making changes, imagining how they might be interpreted before they were even completed. This was the emotional cost of constant oversight. The system did not need to impose pressure directly at all times. It had already shaped behavior through repetition. Once that pattern settled in, it sustained itself. Yet within this environment, small moments of connection began to emerge. They were not dramatic. They did not involve open conversations about the HOA or its influence. Instead, they appeared in subtle ways, shared glances, quiet acknowledgments, brief exchanges that carried more meaning than their words suggested. One afternoon, while adjusting a small detail in his yard, the narrator noticed a neighbor watching from across the street. Not with the same intensity as the HOA figure, but with recognition. There was a pause, a moment where both understood something without needing to express it. It was the first time the narrator felt that his experience might not be entirely isolated. That realization began to shift his perspective. He started paying closer attention to others, not in a suspicious way, but in an observant one. He noticed how certain homes experienced similar cycles of attention. How improvements were often followed by inspections. How some residents made adjustments preemptively, as if trying to stay ahead of something unseen. These patterns were not identical, but they were connected. The emotional bridge between residents was not built through conversation. It was built through shared experience. Over time, these quiet connections formed a subtle network of awareness. People did not openly challenge the system, but they began to recognize its behavior collectively. This recognition did not eliminate the pressure, but it reduced the sense of isolation that had once amplified it. For the narrator, this was a turning point. He was no longer experiencing the situation as a singular target. He was part of a broader pattern, one that affected others in ways that were similar, even if not identical. This understanding brought a different kind of strength. Not the kind that leads to immediate action, but the kind that stabilizes perspective. When something is no longer perceived as uniquely personal, it becomes easier to analyze objectively. At the same time, his view of the HOA figure continued to evolve. She was no longer just a source of irritation or pressure. She became part of a larger behavioral system, someone who operated within it effectively, but was also shaped by it. Her actions, while focused, followed predictable rhythms. She observed, reported, and reinforced patterns that the system then carried forward. She did not need to confront directly because the structure itself responded on her behalf. This made her influence both powerful and limited. Powerful because it shaped outcomes. Limited because it depended on the system's ability to process and act on input. The narrator began to see that emotional dynamics were just as important as procedural ones. The system functioned not only through rules, but through how people felt about those rules. Compliance was often driven by discomfort, not agreement. And discomfort thrives in isolation. As awareness spread quietly among residents, that isolation began to weaken. A few neighbors started making small changes that reflected this shift. Adjustments were made with slightly more confidence. Outdoor presence lasted a bit longer. The subtle tension that had defined interactions began to soften, even if only slightly. These changes were not coordinated. They were individual responses to a shared realization. The narrator also began to reflect on his own emotional journey. The frustration he had initially felt had evolved into something more controlled. Not indifference, but focus. Not anger, but awareness. He realized that reacting emotionally to each individual notice had kept him within the system's expected behavior pattern. By stepping back and observing, he had moved outside that pattern. This shift gave him a sense of control that had not been present before. Not control over the system itself, but control over how he interacted with it. At the same time, he understood that awareness alone would not change outcomes. Recognition was only the first step. For any meaningful shift to occur, patterns would need to be documented clearly enough to be undeniable. That realization began to shape his next steps. He refined his documentation process, focusing not just on his own experiences, but on broader patterns within the neighborhood. Without intruding on others, he observed publicly visible conditions and aligned them with enforcement activity. The result was a growing body of evidence that extended beyond personal experience. And with that, the foundation for something larger began to form. By the end of this chapter, the emotional landscape of the story had transformed. What began as isolation had evolved into quiet connection. What began as confusion had become clarity. And what began as passive experience had turned into deliberate observation. The system was still in place. The pressure had not disappeared. The figure of influence remained active. But the environment was no longer the same. Because now, the narrator was not just living within the system. He was understanding how it shaped everyone inside it. And once that understanding exists, it becomes the bridge between experience and action. The shift from awareness to action did not happen all at once. It unfolded gradually, shaped by accumulated observation and a growing sense that the system, once invisible in its inconsistencies, was becoming increasingly visible to those who paid attention. For the narrator, the transition began internally. The patterns he had documented were no longer abstract. They formed a structured narrative, one that connected enforcement timing, selective attention, and procedural inconsistencies into something coherent. It was no longer just a collection of experiences. It was evidence of imbalance. At the same time, the environment around him began to reflect this shift. Inspections became more frequent across the neighborhood, but not evenly distributed. A cluster of properties, including his own, entered a new cycle of heightened attention. Notices arrived closer together. The language became more detailed. The expectations more specific. It felt like pressure. But this time, it felt different. The narrator was no longer interpreting each notice in isolation. He saw them as part of a pattern that was repeating itself, not just for him, but for others as well. The difference now was that he had the documentation to support that understanding. The emotional response that followed was not frustration. It was decision. He began organizing his records with greater precision. Every notice, every correction, every inspection was aligned into a timeline that could be clearly understood without explanation. Visual comparisons were created. Patterns were highlighted. The goal was not to argue, it was to present. At the same time, he became aware that the HOA was entering one of its formal operational phases, a period where reviews, adjustments, and internal evaluations were conducted. These phases were part of the structure, but they also created opportunities. Opportunities for information to be examined more closely. Instead of reacting to the latest wave of enforcement, the narrator prepared to engage the system on its own terms. He submitted a structured request for clarification. Not a complaint. Not an accusation. A request. It focused on consistency. Why certain properties received repeated inspections while others did not. Why similar conditions resulted in different enforcement outcomes. Why timing appeared clustered rather than evenly distributed. The tone remained neutral. The structure remained factual. But the content carried weight. Because it reflected patterns that were difficult to dismiss once presented clearly. The response from the HOA was not immediate. For the first time, there was a delay that extended beyond normal processing time. The acknowledgement came, but without resolution. The matter was marked for internal review. This response signaled something important. The system had not rejected the request outright. It had paused. And pauses, in structured environments, often indicate internal friction. Meanwhile, the neighborhood continued to evolve. The increased enforcement activity had drawn attention. Residents who had previously remained distant began comparing experiences more openly, though still with caution. It became harder to ignore the similarities. Multiple households had received inspections within the same time frame. Several had been cited for minor issues that appeared inconsistent when compared side by side. What had once felt like isolated incidents now appeared connected. The narrator's structured approach began to influence how others interpreted their own experiences. Without direct coordination, a shared understanding started to form. The system, which had relied on fragmented perception, was now being observed collectively. And that changed the dynamic. Within the HOA, the effect of this shift began to surface. Procedural responses became more formal. Communication included more detailed explanations. Some enforcement actions were delayed or revisited. The clarity that once defined decisions was replaced by a more cautious tone. It was not a reversal. It was recalibration. The figure of influence remained active, but her presence carried a different quality. Where there had once been certainty, there was now subtle hesitation. Observations continued, but their translation into enforcement appeared less immediate. It was as if the system itself had become aware of being observed. The narrator continued his approach without deviation. He did not escalate emotionally. He did not seek confrontation. He maintained consistency in documentation and communication, allowing the patterns to speak for themselves. At the same time, he recognized that visibility had introduced a new kind of tension. The system was still intact, but it was no longer operating without resistance. Not resistance in the form of defiance, but resistance in the form of scrutiny. And scrutiny requires response. As internal reviews progressed, small but significant changes began to appear. Some notices were withdrawn without explanation. Others were revised. Inspection frequency decreased slightly, though not uniformly. These changes suggested that the system was adjusting, but not yet stable. The narrator understood that this phase was critical. It was the point where patterns either reassert themselves or begin to shift permanently. To reinforce clarity, he submitted a follow-up, again structured, again neutral. It referenced previous patterns and noted recent adjustments, asking for confirmation of updated enforcement guidelines. This was not confrontation. It was continuation. The response that followed carried a different tone. It acknowledged inconsistencies in general terms and indicated that internal processes were being reviewed to ensure uniform application of rules. It did not admit fault directly, but it recognized imbalance. That recognition marked a turning point. For the first time, the system had responded not just procedurally, but reflectively. The effect of this acknowledgement extended beyond the narrator's situation. It influenced the broader perception of the HOA within the neighborhood. Residents who had remained cautious began to see that the structure was not as fixed as it appeared. That realization reduced the sense of inevitability that had once defined compliance. The environment shifted from passive acceptance to active awareness. The narrator's role in this transformation remained understated, but its impact was evident. His methodical approach had introduced clarity into a system that relied on ambiguity. And clarity, once established, cannot easily be reversed. By the end of this phase, the tension had reached its peak, not in visible conflict, but in structural pressure. The HOA was still functioning. The figure of influence was still present. But the system was no longer operating in the same way. It was adapting. And adaptation, in structured environments, is often the first step toward change. The narrator understood that the outcome was not yet determined. The system could stabilize into a more balanced form, or it could attempt to reassert previous patterns. But one thing was certain. The dynamic had shifted. What was once controlled through selective attention was now being shaped by collective awareness. And that shift would define everything that followed. The tension that had been building beneath the surface did not erupt in a dramatic moment. Instead, it unfolded through a series of quiet developments that, when connected, revealed something far more significant than the narrator had initially expected. The first sign came through delay. The HOA's responses, which had once followed a predictable rhythm, began to stretch into longer intervals. Requests that previously moved through the system with efficiency were now marked by extended review periods. Communications became more formal, more cautious, and notably less definitive. At first glance, this might have appeared as simple administrative backlog. But to someone who had spent months tracking patterns, the shift was unmistakable. Something inside the system had changed. The narrator continued his documentation, but now his focus expanded beyond enforcement patterns. He began examining the structure of responses themselves, the language used, the timing between communications, and the consistency of information across different documents. What he found was not just inconsistency. It was contradiction. In one instance, a guideline referenced in a notice appeared differently in a separate document. In another, enforcement justification cited criteria that were not aligned with officially published standards. These were not minor discrepancies. They were structural misalignments. The more he cross-referenced records, the clearer it became that the system's internal framework was not as unified as it appeared. There were gaps. And those gaps were widening under scrutiny. Around the same time, a broader review phase within the HOA became evident. Meeting summaries began to include references to process evaluation and standardization adjustments. While the language remained neutral, the implications were significant. The system was examining itself. This internal review did not happen in isolation. It was a response, an indirect reaction to the increasing visibility of inconsistencies. As patterns became harder to dismiss, the structure was forced to account for them. The narrator's documentation had contributed to this pressure, but it was not the only factor. Other residents, influenced by the same growing awareness, had begun asking questions in their own ways. Not confrontational questions, but clarifying ones. And clarification, when applied consistently, exposes inconsistency. As the review process continued, the unexpected revelation began to take shape. It did not emerge as a single discovery, but as a convergence of observations. The HOA, while structured as a collective governing body, was not functioning entirely as one. Decision-making authority, particularly in enforcement prioritization, had gradually concentrated within a narrow internal channel. This concentration was not formally documented. It had developed over time. Certain individuals, through consistent involvement and influence, had shaped how rules were interpreted and applied. Their input, while not always explicitly recorded, had guided outcomes in subtle but consistent ways. The woman who had focused on the narrator's property was part of this channel. Not as a sole authority, but as a key contributor to its influence. Her observations, once processed through the system, had carried disproportionate weight. This explained the repeated attention, the timing of notices, and the persistence of enforcement even after compliance. It was not just observation. It was influence translated into action. The revelation did not paint the system as deliberately malicious. Instead, it revealed how imbalance can form within structured environments. Over time, informal authority had merged with formal process, creating a hybrid system where outcomes were shaped by both, but not always transparently. This was the core issue. Not the existence of rules, but the inconsistency in how they were applied. As this understanding deepened, its effects became visible in the system's behavior. Enforcement patterns began to shift. The narrator's property, once a consistent focal point, experienced a noticeable reduction in attention. Notices decreased. Inspections became less frequent. When they did occur, their tone was more measured, more aligned with documented guidelines. This change was not isolated. Other residents reported similar adjustments. Enforcement became more evenly distributed. Previously overlooked properties entered the inspection cycle, while previously targeted ones experienced relief. The system was recalibrating. But recalibration is not instantaneous. It creates transitional instability, and that instability became visible in procedural inconsistencies. Some notices were issued and then withdrawn. Others were revised after initial delivery. Communication included more qualifiers, more references to guidelines, more acknowledgement of review processes. The certainty that once defined enforcement had been replaced by caution. Inside the HOA structure, this caution reflected deep attention. Decision-making, once streamlined through concentrated influence, now required broader validation. Committees that had previously functioned with limited impact began to reassert their role. Discussions extended longer. Outcomes took more time. The system was redistributing authority. And in doing so, it revealed just how concentrated it had become. For the narrator, this was the moment of full clarity. What had started as a personal experience of repeated enforcement was now understood as part of a larger structural imbalance. His situation had not been random. It had been shaped by a system that allowed informal influence to guide formal outcomes. But more importantly, that system was now being corrected. Not through confrontation. Not through external intervention. But through exposure of its own inconsistencies. This was the unexpected revelation. The system had not been broken by force. It had been revealed by pattern. And once revealed, it could not continue operating in the same way. The emotional impact of this realization was complex. There was a sense of validation, confirmation that his observations had been accurate. But there was also a deeper understanding of how easily systems can drift from their intended structure. The narrator reflected on how gradual the process had been. At no point had the system declared itself imbalanced. It had simply evolved into that state through accumulation of influence and lack of scrutiny. And it had required sustained observation to bring that imbalance into focus. As the HOA continued its internal adjustments, the figure of influence became less prominent. Her presence remained, but its effect was diminished. Decisions no longer aligned as consistently with her observations. The system that once amplified her input now processed it within a broader framework. This change did not erase her role. But it redefined it. From dominant influence to one voice among many. The neighborhood atmosphere reflected this shift. Residents became more engaged, though still measured. Awareness had replaced uncertainty. While caution remained, it was no longer rooted in confusion. People understood the system more clearly, and that understanding changed how they interacted with it. For the narrator, the experience had moved beyond personal resolution. It had become insight. He had seen how structure can conceal imbalance, how perception can sustain authority, and how visibility can initiate correction. The system was still in transition. The final outcome was not yet fully established. But the direction was clear. The imbalance had been exposed. And exposure, once it reaches a certain threshold, leads to change. the change didn't happen overnight. There was no dramatic moment where everything suddenly shifted. Instead, the pressure that once surrounded the narrator's life slowly faded, replaced by something unfamiliar: balance. The constant notices stopped. Inspections became routine instead of targeted. For the first time since moving in, his property felt like his own again, not a space under watch. The system that once seemed unpredictable began to follow clear and consistent patterns. Across the neighborhood, the atmosphere softened. People spent more time outside. Conversations felt less guarded. The quiet tension that had defined daily life began to disappear. Nothing about the rules had changed drastically, but the way they were applied had. The HOA itself had adjusted. Decisions were no longer driven by one person's influence. Processes became more structured, more transparent. The imbalance that once gave someone the feeling of control had been corrected, not through confrontation, but through exposure. The woman who once acted like she owned the narrator's property was still there. But her power was different now. Limited. Balanced. No longer able to shape outcomes on her own. And that was the real turning point. The narrator didn't win in the traditional sense. There was no public defeat, no dramatic apology. What happened was quieter, but far more important. The system changed. What once operated through control and selective pressure now functioned through consistency. And that shift affected everyone, not just him. Looking back, the lesson was clear. Power in systems like this doesn't always come from rules, it comes from how those rules are used. And when no one questions that use, control can grow quietly, almost invisibly. But once patterns are seen, they can't be ignored. The narrator never needed to fight the system. He only needed to understand it. And in doing so, he made it visible. Because once a system is exposed, it can no longer pretend to be something it's not. And that's what changed everything.